Welcome. The lesson today is going to be the overview of the rapture. The rapture itself tends to be a hot topic in Christian circles. We're not going to get so much into all of that today. We're going to just be talking about terms, what they mean, so that in future lessons we will all be on the same page. So let's just jump right in. Let me go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint. All right, the rapture overview of 4 different views. You might have heard of only 3 views, but there are 4, and we'll get into that. Futurism it interprets most of the events of the Olivet Discourse, that's in Matthew 24, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Revelation as yet to be fulfilled in the future. So it says events are still going to be fulfilled. They have not been completed yet. We did a study of Matthew 24, and there's some like preterists who think that most of this already happened in the 1st century or right after the 1st century. But futurism believes that most of these events are still to come. Next, we have the term premillennialism. Premillennialism is the belief that the millennium, which means the 1,000-year reign of Christ, lasts a literal 1,000 years and begins after the literal bodily, meaning comes physically in person, second coming of Jesus. So these are some big words that we're going to be throwing out. So just, pause this if you need to, write this down. Premillennialism means that Jesus is going to return physically before the 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth. And that's going to be literally 1,000 years and last that long and be a physical reign. We will get into views about other types of millennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism, in another episode, but not in this one. This one just deals with anyone that talks about the rapture is usually talking about a premillennial view. The word rapture itself is not used in the Bible. It comes from the Latin word rapere, I believe, which means to seize or to abduct. It is translated from the Greek word for caught up, which is very difficult to say, harpagia samatha? I don't know. This phrase is found in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 17 and describes the moment when those who are still alive at the second coming of Jesus meet him in the air. This event is also described in the Gospels as the gathering of the elect. So these are the references that you can turn to on your own. We're not going to go there right now because we already discussed these in previous episodes. Matthew 24:31, Mark 13:27, and Luke 21:28. Where we are going to go is that 1 Thessalonians passage. It's one that's used a lot when people talk about rapture. So let's go there. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 17. It says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the archangel's voice, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are still alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore encourage one another with these words." So that is one of the major passages used to talk about the rapture. So as you see, the word is not there, but it's describing this meeting of God with Jesus in the air. Premillennialists all believe in the rapture of the church. So even we're talking about 4 different types of premillennialists in this lesson, but they just disagree on when it will happen. So, a lot of times people can get caught up in the ways that they disagree. They can get very heated and frustrated. But truly, if you believe in premillennialism, you're already in the same chapter. You might be on a different page within the chapter. So they already have in common more than they would have in common with a postmillennialist or an amillennialist, for example. So I do want to caution all of you, I have a position I believe in strongly. I'm not going to reveal it during this episode. In later ones I will, but it's fine. And there's I think there's dangers in believing some of the other things. However, this is not something you divide with other Christians over, that you spend a lot of time debating. And I mean, you can discuss passionately your views, but being careful not to cause division or disunity among others, and encourage one another rather than put each other down. Obviously, always talking kindly to one another about this, but it doesn't mean you can't have a position and that you can't defend that position. But this is a secondary doctrine. So while it's important, it is not something that gets you to heaven or hell. So, believing in any one of these positions, or even believing in amillennialism, postmillennialism, does not mean that you're not on, that your salvation is not attainable for you. So just be cautious when you are talking to other believers about that. All right, so let's get into the 4 views that I mentioned. First is pre-tribulation. And I know this can get very confusing between premillennialism and pre-tribulation. So let's just kind of explain it, hopefully in a way that will help you remember it. Pre-tribulation is rapture happens before the 7-year period they call the tribulation. So premillennialism, remember, is believing that Jesus comes back before the 1,000-year reign, the millennium. This is focusing in further, it's like zoom in. This is within that 7-year period beforehand. It means you're going up before that 7-year period starts. There's a 7-year period before the millennium begins. So pre-trib, basically this position, all of these positions are basically discussing at what point during this 7-year period does the rapture occur. So pre-tribulationists believe it happens before the 7-year period starts, and they call that entire period the tribulation. Now, mid-tribulationists believe the rapture happens at the midpoint of the 7-year period, the 3.5 years in. So they believe it happens before, and this is crucial, before the Antichrist, the abomination of desolation that you might have heard about in another lesson, before the Antichrist is revealed. So both of these positions, pre-trib and mid-trib, believe that before the persecution begins to take place, Christians are raptured and they are able to escape that. So pre-tribulation, beginning of the 7-year period, mid-tribulation, 3.5 years in, the midpoint. Okay, post-tribulationists are going to believe that the rapture happens at the end of the 7-year period, the very end. And then this final one that is probably not known as well is called Prewrath. It believes that the rapture will happen sometime during the second half of the 7-year period. So some people can get it confused with mid-tribulation, but it should not be confused with that, because Prewrath people believe adamantly that the Antichrist will be on the scene before Christians are taken up, that they will actually be persecuted by the Antichrist, but before the Antichrist has a chance to kill off all Christians, there's some time during that last 3.5 years that we don't know when, that Christians will be taken up. And then that will be followed soon after by what you'll learn about later is called the Day of the Lord. So those are the 4 views: pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, post-tribulation, and pre-wrath. And let me just show this to you on a handy little chart. So I like visuals. So this shows you, as you can see, this yellow band right here is the kingdom, the millennial kingdom. So all 4 of these positions that discuss the rapture at all are going to believe that Jesus comes before the millennium. So they're all premillennialists. Can be a tongue twister. So Remember, pre-trib, they think the rapture is right here at the beginning of this 7-year period. And that the wrath of God, they describe the entire tribulation as the wrath of God. Midtrib believes that Christians will be here during the first 3.5 years. They're raptured in the middle. Then the wrath of God is called the Great Tribulation, as opposed to the tribulation. They make that distinction. And that Jesus comes back here at the end. Post-trib believes that they don't know at which point the wrath of God really begins, but the rapture for sure is at the end and after this wrath of God is already poured out. But that I think they believe that, people are protected, Christians are protected from some of the consequences of that wrath. All right, pre-wrath would describe this period up to this point, especially the second 3.5 years when it begins. They consider that the wrath of Satan, which is poured out through the Antichrist in tribulation and persecution of believers. They have a question mark here because they do not know at which point believers are raptured. And then the wrath of God is definitely after the rapture. But they would consider this time period the day of the Lord, this undefinable, not one day, but an undefinable time period. That's the day of the Lord. And you can see kind of how this is all broken down. All this 3.5 years, 1260 days, those days are repeated often in Daniel and in Revelation, discussion of specific days. So that's why you've got this breakdown of the days. All right. Another word used to describe those who believe the rapture will occur before the tribulation is dispensational premillennialism. I know this is like full of big words. Dispensational premillennialism. And I'll get into what that's about. Both pre-trib and mid-trib. So let me go back and show you the top 2 views on this chart. Pre-trib, mid-trib. Both of those are dispensational premillennialists. Jumping ahead. They both fall into that category. It's called dispensational because it breaks history up into 2 different periods based on how God relates to human beings during those periods. There's often like 7 dispensations, depends on the authors that you look at. We'll get into more of that when we get into premillennialism. Okay, and then another word to describe those who believe Christians will endure the Great Tribulation and be raptured before the day of the Lord is historical premillennialism. At least that's not an unfamiliar word. Historical premillennialism. So when we go back to the chart, these bottom 2, post-trib and pre-wrath, both of those are historical premillennialism. They both fall in that category. It is called historical because it is the oldest Christian view of the end times. It is what the early church fathers believed. In future lessons, we'll talk about specifics regarding what early church fathers actually said. We'll read their full quotes. I'm not pulling them out of context. I'm reading the whole thing so you can see exactly what they said and what they believed about the end times. So that's why it's called historical. All right, so I found this chart and I've given it credit down here in the Rose Guide to End Time Prophecy by Timothy Paul Jones, page 329. So I have this chart from there that breaks down the differences. Historical premillennialism, which I said was those bottom 2. They have different ideas in addition to how, when they think, it's not just when they think the rapture is occurring that they're different on. They're also different on God's work with the nation of Israel and the church. So historical premillennialists believe that God has always had one plan for redemption. God works with the nation of Israel. His work with the nation of Israel was a temporary picture of what God had already purposed to do through Jesus and through the church. Now that's different from dispensational premillennialism in that God has purposed to work with two different groups of people. They separate them. Israel and church, they see as two separate entities, and they believe that God works with them in different ways in distinct dispensations. That's where they get that word dispensational. They believe God will fulfill his promises to the patriarchs and to the people of Israel through the modern nation of Israel. Now, going back to historical premillennialism, the church, through Jesus, God is fulfilling the promises that he made to Israel. In the Old Testament and the New, God's plan has always been to redeem every person who trusts in God's Messiah. And then finally, Jesus came to accomplish this redemption through his death and resurrection. Now, in dispensational premillennialism, they believe that God offered an earthly kingdom to Israel. Since Israel's religious leaders rejected this kingdom, God formed a spiritual kingdom that included Gentiles. In the Old and the New Testaments, God's plan has always been to redeem every person who trusts in God's Messiah. Of course, that is the same as what historical premillennialists believe right there, that second half. During the Great Tribulation, this is where it's very different. During the Great Tribulation, dispensational premillennialists believe that God will remove the church from the world and resume his work with the nation of Israel. Some of what they describe is that they believe that God does not work with the two at the same time. So he's removing the church and then focusing in on Israel instead. All right, now pretribulationism is the most popular view among American Protestant pastors. 36%, that's 1/3, according to Lifeway research. So none of the other views have as much popularity as pre-tribulationism. And we will get into that later when we discuss pre-tribulationism. We will explore all four of these views by looking at the following. Sorry, it just kind of jumps ahead sometimes. We're going to be breaking it down each time with the history of that view, who's who, meaning who's the important theologians, the famous preachers, the famous, who started all of this, early church fathers. That's the who's who, so that you will know who those people are who believe this. And then we'll go into the arguments that they make to support their view, and then the verses and scripture that they use to support it. So that is going to be the layout for all the next presentation. So mid-tribulationism comes next. It's going to be shortest because there's not as much on it. Then we're going to be doing pre-trib, followed by post and pre-wrath. So in each of those cases, that's going to be the format I use: history, who's who, arguments, and scriptural support. And that is the end of this presentation.